Yeah. Goes all the way to Washington, D.C., huh? Goes all the way to Washington, D.C.
I don't know.
Yeah, you Homeland Security?
No.
Yeah. How far have you taken this down to, how far have you actually ran a load?
From out of here.
100 miles? Up to Maine?
Close to Maine.
No shit. How many miles do you think that is? Man, that's unbelievable. Not to mention, I heard there's one that goes all the way to Colorado, right? Unbelievable. What do you think you're hauling? Any idea?
Crap.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Crap makes all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
You don't really know.
Yeah. I know there's been a lot of military stuff being hauled around lately, that's for sure, huh?
Yeah, but not in we deliver to military.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
For their food.
Yeah. 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 Well, I appreciate I heard that's water supply, food supply, everything's in there.
Huh?
Yeah, unbelievable.
But you don't get no cell phone for service.
No. Peace, brother. I mean, basically, you got an underground roadway system here that runs all the way to Maine, to Washington, D.C., to Colorado. It's fully stocked. It runs completely underground. And you can see they've been hauling tons of military equipment. You know, they're stocking all these bases. Now, the other thing is the railroad system here is also very strategic. They're bringing in boxcar loads and they're dump shipping here, and they can really deliver to all these locations, which these locations go all the way to Area 51. These locations go all the way to Washington, D.C. There's access underneath the White House to this location, okay? So this is a strategic location, which is really the new command center for the Illuminati and the United States government. Well, forget the United States government. This is a headquarters for the Illuminati. This is where they'll ship most of their supplies. When they go underground, they can stay underground for quite some time. And this is stocked with food, water, everything they need. It's an underground city. So this is the north entrance, and we're going to go see if we can do some more digging.
Well, it would seem some very strange happenings are going on. First, I remind you to go back in history and remember Donald Rumsfeld's comment the day before the attack of 9/11, where he said that the Pentagon had lost $2.3 trillion, and then just fortunately, then the Pentagon was destroyed the next day on 9/11, 2001. Well, I believe a lot of that money went to go to spending for certain operations for the CIA, FEMA, Homeland Security, and a lot of that was building underground military complex. Fast forward to August of this year, if you remember that DC that happened, Virginia, Washington DC, and also in Colorado, there's evidence pointing to that not being an earthquake as much as it was probably a nuclear explosion done by the good guys, the Black Ops military, who found out about the the evil plans of the globalists that were planning on killing off a huge percentage of the population and going and running and hiding in the military underground complex. So what they've done is cut off some escape routes during that time. And the reason I say it was probably nuclear as opposed to an earthquake is the seismograph showed that there were no primary waves associated with these two explosions. And they were very shallow. And also in an area that doesn't receive many earthquakes. Now, the latest report that I'm getting is long about September 20th, 21st, 22nd of this year, there were at least 13 very powerful underground explosions rocking the United States Midwest, and they registered as small shallow earthquakes with the USGS. Many of the underground high explosive detonations registered as 2.6 magnitude earthquakes. So what they're saying is the U.S. military is sealing off the tunnels so that the globalists and the U.S. ghost government, i.e. the Federal Reserve bankers, FEMA, the DHS, CIA, they can't run and hide from what they're predicting to occur here long about September 27th, give or take a day or two of this year, here just real soon. Officers in the U.S. military didn't seem to be aware of Obama and the globalist plan converging on Denver for a DEFCON 1 meeting, meaning nuclear war imminent, a cocked pistol drill. Email was sent to the U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations on September 21st of 2011 to alert them to a planned false flag nuclear detonation on U.S. soil somewhere in the American Midwest. The U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations were the ones who raided the Citadel gun and safe store in Las Vegas on August 21st to recover stolen nuclear warhead detonators. They were the ones who intercepted the transfer of improvised nuclear warheads by the CIA in the tunnels that connected the deep underground military bases on August 23, 2011. The impoverished nuclear bombs, the W-54 style warheads, they were being transferred via those tunnels to Washington, D.C. and New York City when they detonated during a firefight between U.S. military personnel and the criminal CIA, DHS, FEMA operatives. It would appear that the U.S. military had a deadline to meet and has already damaged, destroyed, or sealed at least 13 underground tunnels or bases, and perhaps their incentive was the fact that Obama, his shadow government, and the globalists had made plans to save their own hides while leaving the rest of us to fend for ourselves. Perhaps they investigated and confirmed that another false flag nuclear detonation was imminent and acted accordingly to prevent it.
The following video details the contents of a Department of Defense document entitled Internment and Resettlement Operations, also known as FM 3-39.40. The document is 325 pages long and it is signed by Joyce E. Morrow, Administrative Assistant to the Secretary of the Army. It was created in 2010, however, has just been recently leaked to the public via the internet and can now be downloaded from multiple sources. In the description below, you'll find a download link for the document. I strongly encourage you to download it yourself and to verify everything that's being said here. The document outlines military procedures for internment and resettlement of civilians, and it describes the layout and the administration of these internment camps. It clearly states on page 38 that it applies within U.S. territory, and it specifically addresses the detainment of U.S. citizens, as is indicated by the identification procedures for new prisoners on page 146, which states that social security numbers are to be recorded alongside their photograph and fingerprints. Included in the list of organizations which may be involved in these internment operations are the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, the Department of Defense, and the United Nations. On page 56, the document outlines the responsibilities of psychological operations officers within the camps, among which it states that a PSYOP officer develops and executes indoctrination programs to reduce or remove antagonistic attitudes and identifies political activists. On page 281, the document goes into more detail regarding the role of psychological operations within the camps, specifically in regards to pacifying the population and ensuring cooperation. On page 238, it gives the conditions for the use of deadly force in such camps. Among the justifications for lethal force, it includes to terminate an active escape attempt. That point right there should make it clear that these camps are not benevolent disaster relief type facilities. On page 244, the document calls for the use of snipers during riots to, quote, scan a crowd and identify agitators and riot leaders for apprehension and fire lethal rounds if warranted. On page 260, it shows the basic layout for a facility focusing on detainment. It is depicted with interrogation areas, tribunal areas, and mortuaries. Each detainment facility is designed to hold 4,000 prisoners, and they are depicted with multiple levels of barbed wire separating compartments within the facilities, with a double barbed wire fence enclosing them, and watched over by 24 guard towers. On page 261, the document depicts the layout for what they call civilian resettlement facilities, which are designed to house 8,000 people. Though it uses the word resettlement, the plans show multiple levels of barbed wire dividing the sections of the facility, with double barbed wire fencing on the outside, as well as 16 guard towers. On page 262, the layout for facilities designed for what they call non-compliant prisoners is shown. These camps are designed to hold up to 300 prisoners, they have 3 interrogation centers, and are guarded by 13 guard towers. Now, if there's any question whether these plans are active or just theoretical, this should be settled by the fact that the U.S. Army has been running ads for job positions in these camps since 2009, and apparently, they're still hiring. Once again, if you look in the description, you'll find all the links you need to verify this information. It's important to note here that this document was created in 2010, which was under the Obama administration, and it predates the NDAA of 2012, which authorized military detainment of U.S. citizens. This clearly shows a long-term agenda at work. If you believe that this is important information for people to know about, then please share this video with as many people as you can. Share it on Facebook and on Twitter. Send it in emails to friends and family. Especially send it to anyone you know within the police and military. A smart strategy would be to download the PDF yourself and email it to people as an attachment with a link to this video so that they know how to navigate the document.
Nuclear arsenal of the United States. The plan will cost the country about $355 billion over the next decade, which is $150 billion more than its previous budget. Furthermore, costs are expected to greatly increase after the year 2023. On this edition of the debate, we'll ask what happened to all the talk about decreasing nuclear weapons from the U.S. and try to find out why the U.S., the only country to have used nuclear weapons, still believes nuclear weapons serve as a deterrent, while it preaches otherwise to other countries.
The U.S. is the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons against another nation, namely Japan in the Second World War. The U.S. nuclear attacks on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 left an estimated 200,000 people dead. America also used depleted uranium in Iraq, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The U.S. still has the world's largest arsenal of active nuclear warheads. President Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 partly because of his pledge to eradicate thousands of nuclear warheads as part of a deal with Russia known as the New START Treaty. He made big promises with regards to the U.S. nukes.
First, the United States will take concrete steps towards a world without nuclear weapons. To put an end to Cold War thinking, we will reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy and urge others to do the same.
Critics say Obama's words are not consistent with the actions of his administration. Obama is being accused of reneging on his disarmament pledges as his administration has drawn up plans for a large-scale upgrade of atomic bombs, delivery systems, and laboratories. The U.S. Congressional Budget Office says the plan will cost the country about $355 billion over the next decade. The figure is nearly $150 billion more than the administration's plan last year. The upgrade will result in more accurate and deadlier weapons. Many experts have warned that the modernization will actually create new weapons and is therefore seen as a violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. A total of 190 countries, including the U.S., have joined the NPT. The treaty seeks to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons technology, to promote cooperation in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and to further the goal of complete disarmament. But the United States is clearly not moving toward annihilating its atomic weapons, as demanded by the NPT. Washington says nuclear weapons served as a deterrent, while it preaches otherwise to other countries. But many reject that notion as implausible, saying such destructive weapons in fact undermine global security, as it will trigger an arms race among other nuclear states.
Well, let's see what our guest thinks. Let me introduce him. From the Answer Coalition, Brian Becker joins us from Washington. And we have former U.S. diplomat George Lambrakis, who joins us from London. Gentlemen, welcome. George Lambrakis started out in 2011 as $75 billion to maintain U.S. nuclear weapons. Then it increased to a whopping $300 billion in 2012. And now, as the year is drawing to a close, $355 billion or $450 billion over the next decade, depending on which report you're looking at. Also, with costs likely to increase after 2023. What's your reaction when you hear about these astronomical figures being spent on the nuclear program of the United States, which includes nuclear weapons?
Well, I may surprise you in telling you that I'm not for the increasing militarization of American foreign policy, which has been taking place ever since the United States got involved in the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, following the attack on the United States, the fact that the United States is spending much more money on the military than perhaps it needs to. I'm not a general, so I can't give you details. But it seems to me that we could move towards less militarization. However, let me also point out that even if $355 billion sounds like a lot, over a decade, you're talking over a decade of about $140 to $200 trillion of American budget. Americans pay their military personnel, all their personnel, more than most countries in the world. A large part of the budget is that. There are also expensive equipment to be bought, and Americans probably pay high prices for that equipment. However, as far as reacting to some of the introduction that I heard from the very anti-American person trying to explain that the Americans were the first to use bombs to end World War II, I should also point out that the American deterrent prevented the Cold War from becoming a hot one over the period, 20 or 30 years, 40 years, however you count it, since that started. There's a very famous quote that Stalin was once told, one isn't sure by whom, that the Americans were a paper target, not to worry about them. And he said, yes, but they have nuclear teeth. And the Americans, of course, have had to rely on nuclear weapons as a deterrent throughout the last post-World War II period. This is not a time for the United States to get rid of its nuclear weapons when so many other countries seem determined to find ways of getting some. And of course, even large countries like Russia and China maintain very large stocks, Russia particularly. China is building more. So the United States may be modernizing. It isn't necessarily going to mean it's going to have more weapons. When the Americans modernize, they get rid of the old ones. And in many ways, the modernization may make the holding of those weapons safer. And as I say, I'm not a general to give you the details, but my general feeling is, yes, we should get away from militarization. Diplomacy should play a bigger role in American foreign policy, but I'm not impressed by these numbers. After all, you're talking $35 billion a year in a 14 trillion. That's 1 trillion is 1,000 billion economy, so it's not a huge number.
Brian Becker.
The U.S. has spent $7 trillion on nuclear weapons since they first used them in 1945. They kept the cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima clean. In other words, they didn't firebomb them as they did Tokyo, so that they would have the opportunity to see for themselves and to show the world the destructive power of nuclear weapons when they were used. So yes, they did incinerate 200,000 people. Nagasaki and Hiroshima were civilian cities. They were not military targets. It was an act of the most cold-blooded brutality. The U.S. was hoping to have a monopoly on nuclear weapons, to be able to bully the Soviet Union, to press the Soviet Union, to push around the rest of the world. It was their great fear that others would overcome that monopoly, and the Soviet Union did in 1950. Your other guest said there's been a period of prolonged peace because of U.S. nuclear weapons. Well, I would say, what was the Korean War, where 5 million Koreans perished, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, or the Vietnam War, where 3 million died? The United States uses nuclear technology and nuclear weapons in order to bully other countries. The new expansion by the United States, the upgrade, the new generation of nuclear weapons is an expansion, and it is a clear violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which states clearly that there is an affirmative obligation by all of the nuclear powers to begin the process of nuclear disarmament so that the other countries could be dissuaded from getting nuclear technologies themselves. Instead of acting as they are obligated to under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, not only the United States, but Britain too just announced a major refurbishment of its nuclear weapons program. They say to the Iranian government that the mere possession of nuclear plants, even those for civilian energy purposes, somehow constitute an existential threat to humanity. They tell the Iranian people that they will be sanctioned brutally, deprived of that which is necessary to sustain life in a civilian economy in the modern world because they have a nuclear program. And as the Iranian government goes ahead and tries to come to some negotiated settlement to create an easing of sanctions, the United States and Britain arrogantly announced that they are not only going to impose new sanctions on Iran in spite of its compliance with the interim agreement in Geneva, but they are in fact planning to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, new dollars, on new nuclear weapons, and that is a contravention of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and a complete violation of the spirit and the letter of the nuclear negotiations that are taking place.
George Lambrakis, I think you said not true to one of Brian Becker's statement there. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, there is no absolute requirement that you unilaterally reduce your weapons. The United States, as you know, President Obama has tried very hard to get the world to think about reducing them. Unfortunately, President Putin in Russia is not reacting. The Chinese are still building up their nuclear power rather than the other way around. So I think the president at present has had to reach an agreement with a Republican in the House. For the first time, we've managed to get out of the budget wars. And let's face it, whatever is said now about what will be done over the next decade can be changed in a year or two. All American budgets are constantly being looked at over and over again. So I'm not terribly excited about that. I will tell your speaker that
no, you're for the nuclear weapons program.
A little bit more about history and about law. You know, when you talk about what happened in World War II, the use of the bombs, of course, stopped the war and prevented what many people thought might be as many as 100,000 American war dead, several 100,000 Japanese more dead. The idea that they did it in order to
that's the tired old narrative about the use of the nuclear
Russians
weapons
is a story that has come up. This is something that has been built up in the context of the Cold War. The Americans weren't thinking of a Cold War when they used the bombs in 1945. We're not talking ancient history, we're talking today's realities. And when you talk about today's realities, you can't just throw around words like it's illegal.
Brian Becker, go ahead. Let's get Brian Becker to get a reaction to you there, George Lambrakis.
Sure.
Yeah,
and by the way,
I mean, throwing around words, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is
He's an American too, by the way.
The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is very, very clear. It says that non-nuclear powers are agreeing to not become possessors of nuclear weapons in exchange for the major nuclear powers to begin the process and go forward with the process of nuclear disarmament. That's the quid pro quo. Now, nobody can say that the United States is moving towards nuclear disarmament. In fact, not only did Obama announce that there's going to be a $350 billion upgrade of nuclear weapons, not only did the British Defense Secretary announce the same thing, but the Senate 2 days ago voted to authorize the creation of 2 new huge secret underground plutonium production labs that will expand plutonium production for the next 150 years. That's a very important fact, and I think the world isn't yet learning about it, or just learning about it. This is going to be in Los Alamos, the nuclear facility in New Mexico, and the U.S. government has just announced, in spite of environmental impact statements and in spite of everything, to rush forward with the creation of 2 new plutonium factories, modules that will be producing plutonium for decades and decades to come. That's to enrich and enhance nuclear weapons. The United States is moving nuclear weapons into outer space. That's one of the big projects. They see nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons possession as a form of creating dominance. It's not keeping the world safe. Nuclear weapons are, by their own use, inherently a war crime. They can't distinguish between soldiers and civilians. That was certainly true when the U.S. dropped nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Wiping out 200,000 people instantly, that's a war crime. That's a crime against humanity and a crime against peace. And the U.S. has continued to be addicted to nuclear weapons ever since.
Very well. Quick time out here before we bring you in, George Lombrakis. Let's listen to some of the viewer comments I posted on our Facebook page.
Lies, lies, and more lies. Will Obama be doing this while he holds his Nobel Peace Prize? If the US modernizes its nuclear weapon, it's okay. Why can't Iran produce nuclear energy?
Just some of the viewer comments there. I'm looking here, George Lombrakis, at, first of all, what Brian Becker said there is quite enlightening in terms of the plutonium that the U.S. is going to produce for 150 years. Now, when this report came out, we have this statement by the Air Force General Robert Keller. He's the head of the U.S. Strategic Command. He said the United States is at the start of a multi-decade effort to recapitalize its nuclear deterrent force and its supporting infrastructure. So this, based on what he's saying, is multi-decade in effort. So it's going to run for decades. You're saying that perhaps there's going to be budget restraints or talks that may derail this. My question is, when you talk about deterrent, doesn't it only take one nuclear bomb? What is this theory of deterrence? A nuclear deterrent that's actually going to be effective? That doesn't make sense. That's a statement many people, many average people are asking.
I'm not sure what your question was aimed at, but I think the idea of producing more than one weapon is the idea of deterring someone who has, like North Korea, like Iran has been suspected of preparing several weapons, from getting too excited about using them, but not particularly just using them, but doing other nasty things and saying, if you stop us in any way, we're going to use nuclear weapons. The idea that the NPT
isn't this what the U.S. is doing? Isn't this what the U.S. is indirectly doing then?
Let me just keep saying, the NPT treaty said that it would be, if countries stopped trying to create nuclear weapons, those countries that had them were responsible for reducing them and eventually, as Obama has said, getting rid of them. Other American presidents have tried to talk that way. Reagan wanted to do it many years ago. However, the world is not reducing their weapons. They're trying to get, new countries are trying to get new weapons. Iran is suspected very strongly of that. And if my American colleague keeps talking about them, the American government, he's part of it, he's part of the American people, he's talking as if he's an Iranian, describing how innocent American, Iranian efforts are and how one should never imagine them.
You know, that's disgusting, because I disagree with the American, because I disagree with the U.S. government, because I disagree with the U.S. government, then I'm talking like an Iranian? Really? You know, people here have the right to disagree with their government. I think we have the right to speak up. We have the right to speak out. We have the right to say to the government that speaks in our name, and continues to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on nuclear weapons. By saying that, we don't say we're from some other country. Excuse me.
Just talk?
George Lombrakis, go ahead.
Well, you don't have to also...
No, I should just listen to you nonstop with all the babble.
you don't have to, at the same time, try to describe the Iranian efforts as very innocent, which is what you did. You can freely attack your own government policies.
Well, you know what? There's no proof that Iran has a nuclear weapon. The United States government does not say that Iran has a nuclear weapon.
Yes, well,
the Iranian government has agreed in negotiations to not enrich uranium over 5%. That process is underway. The Iranian government does not right now have a nuclear weapon. I want to say one other thing. The reason the U.S. has 5,000 nuclear weapons is not because they're going to be overwhelmed by North Korea or if Iran gets a bomb. The reason they have 5,000 weapons is for dominance. In other words, you don't need 5 bombs or 10 bombs. They have 5,000 bombs, 5,000 nuclear weapons, and they're building a new generation of nuclear weapons. That's not a defensive operation. That's an offensive operation. When you put up missile defense shield around the world, it's not in order to stop, quote, rogue nations from carrying out a strike. That's for a first strike strategy.
Well, it would seem some very strange happenings are going on. First, I remind you to go back in history and remember Donald Rumsfeld's comment the day before the attack of 9/11, where he said that the Pentagon had lost $2.3 trillion, and then just fortunately, then the Pentagon was destroyed the next day on 9/11, 2001. Well, I believe a lot of that money went to go to spending for certain operations for the CIA, FEMA, Homeland Security, and a lot of that was building underground military complex. Fast forward to August of this year, if you remember that DC that happened, Virginia, Washington DC, and also in Colorado, there's evidence pointing to that not being an earthquake as much as it was probably a nuclear explosion done by the good guys, the Black Ops military, who found out about the evil plans of the globalists that were planning on killing off a huge percentage of the population and going and running and hiding in the military underground complex. So what they've done is cut off some escape routes during that time. And the reason I say it was probably nuclear as opposed to an earthquake is the seismograph showed that there were no primary waves associated with these two explosions, and they were very shallow, and also in an area that doesn't receive many earthquakes. Now, the latest report that I'm getting is long about September 20th, 21st, 22nd of this year, there were at least 13 very powerful underground explosions rocking the United States Midwest, and they registered as small shallow earthquakes with the USGS. Many of the underground high explosive detonations registered as 2.6 magnitude earthquakes. So what they're saying is the U.S. military is sealing off the tunnels so that the globalists and the U.S. ghost government, i.e. the Federal Reserve bankers, FEMA, the DHS, CIA, they can't run and hide from what they're predicting to occur here long about September 27th, give or take a day or two of this year, here just real soon. Officers in the U.S. military didn't seem to be aware of Obama and the globalist plan converging on Denver for a DEFCON 1 meeting, meaning nuclear war imminent. A cocked pistol drill. Email was sent to the U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations on September 21st of 2011 to alert them to a planned false flag nuclear detonation on U.S. soil somewhere in the American Midwest. The U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations were the ones who raided the Citadel gun and safe store in Las Vegas on August 21st to recover stolen nuclear warhead detonators. They were the ones who intercepted the transfer of improvised nuclear warheads by the CIA in the tunnels that connected the deep underground military bases on August 23, 2011. The impoverished nuclear bombs, the W-54 style warheads, they were being transferred via those tunnels to Washington, D.C. and New York City when they detonated during a firefight between U.S. military personnel and the criminal CIA, DHS, FEMA operatives. It would appear that the U.S. military had a deadline to meet and has already damaged, destroyed, or sealed at least 13 underground tunnels or bases, and perhaps their incentive was the fact that Obama, his shadow government, and the globalists had made plans to save their own hides while leaving the rest of us to fend for ourselves. Perhaps they investigated and confirmed that another false flag nuclear detonation was imminent and acted accordingly to prevent it.
Yeah. Goes all the way to Washington, D.C., huh? Goes all the way to Washington, D.C. Yeah, you Homeland Security? Yeah. How far have you leavable?
You don't get no cell phone for service.
No. Peace, brother. I mean, basically, you got an underground roadway system here that runs all the way to Maine, to Washington, D.C., to Colorado. It's fully stocked. It runs completely underground. And you can see they've been hauling tons of military equipment. You know, they're stocking all these bases. Now, the other thing is the railroad system here is also very strategic. They're bringing in boxcar loads and they're dump shipping here, and they can really deliver to all these locations, which these locations go all the way to Area 51. These locations go all the way to Washington, D.C. There's access underneath the White House to this location, okay? So this is a strategic location, which is really the new command center for the Illuminati and the United States government. Well, forget the United States government. This is a headquarters for the Illuminati. This is where they'll ship most of their supplies. When they go underground, they can stay underground for quite some time. And this is stocked with food, water, everything they need. It's an underground city. So this is the north entrance, and we're going to go see if we can do some more digging.
Well, it would seem some very strange happenings.
You're taking this down to, how far have you actually ran a load? 100 miles? Up to Maine? No shit. How many miles do you think that is? Man, that's unbelievable. Not to mention, I heard there's one that goes all the way to Colorado, right? Unbelievable. What do you think you're hauling? Any idea?
Crap.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Crap makes all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
You don't really know.
Yeah. I know there's been a lot of military stuff being hauled around lately, that's for sure, huh?
Yeah, we deliver to military.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate. I heard that's water supply, food supply, everything's in there. Yeah, unbelievable.
Are going on. First, I remind you to go back in history and remember Donald Rumsfeld's comment the day before the attack of 9/11, where he said that the Pentagon had lost $2.3 trillion, and then just fortunately, then the Pentagon was destroyed the next day on 9/11, 2001. Well, I believe a lot of that money went to go to spending for certain operations for the CIA, FEMA, Homeland Security, and a lot of that was building underground military complex. Fast forward to August of this year, if you'll remember that DC that happened, Virginia, Washington DC, and also in Colorado, there's evidence pointing to that not being an earthquake as much as it was probably a nuclear explosion done by the good guys, the